The 36th Ordinary Session of Africa Union Assembly was held in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia last week. This year the summit was conducted under the theme Accelerating African Continental Free Trade Area. The summit has basically assessed the implementation of Agenda 2063, which is Africa's blueprint to achieve inclusive and sustainable socio-economic development over a 50 years period. The 36th Ordinary Session of African Union Assembly has also discussed on other current and strategic issues impacting Africa. The summit has passed important decisions as well. Hello and welcome, viewers. This is me, Zelalem Ibeltal. My guest for today is Aggrey Mutambo, who is a journalist and editor at Nation Media Group, which is a Nairobi-based media organization. It is the largest independent media house in Eastern and Central Africa. So in my interview with Aggrey Mutambo, I'm going to raise important issues related with the 36th Ordinary Session of African Union Assembly and on the broader issue of Africa Union, its failure, success, and the way forward. By the way, Aggrey Mutambo was here in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, to cover the 36th Ordinary Session of African Union Assembly. Stay tuned.
Thank you. I'm a journalist in Nairobi for the Nation Media Group, and I cover regional issues for quite some time. So I'm quite interested in what happens in our continent and in our region in particular.
All right. Aggrey Mutambo, I know you were here in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to cover the 36th Ordinary Session of African Union Assembly. Let me begin from your impression in Ethiopia. How do you get Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia? What's your impression? What's your special memory here?
I think it's quite a very peaceful city, and people are very hospitable. The weather is very comfortable, and I think it is a city of people who are always willing to learn from the visitors and teach the visitors about their local cultures. And I think it's a good place to be.
How do you see the peace and stability of the country? Because Ethiopia has not been considered as a peaceful country over the last 2-3 years. And now because of the peace agreement between TPLF and the federal government of Ethiopia, Ethiopia is now breathing the air of peace. So how do you see the peace and stability of the country as well?
You know, they say humans can sleep, but it's when you fall is when it's dangerous. So I think Ethiopians were just rising from that kind of sleep, and the fact that they could sit down together and sign a peace agreement itself is a lesson enough and commitment to ensure that the country remains peaceful. So I think we are very encouraged by the recent events, and we're very encouraged by the leadership to decide that the country matters more than personal ambitions. And I think this is something very encouraging and quite something to praise.
This year, the 36th Ordinary Session of African Union Assembly was held with a theme, Accelerating African Continental Free Trade Area. Can you explain this super important concept to the mass audience, and how that this benefits Africa? How does this boost the economy of Africa?
Yeah, I mean, continental trade has been something which leaders have always admitted as a missing chance, a missed opportunity, so to speak. And so for the last 4 years, they agreed on a continental agreement to open up their borders and allow more traders to move across and sell and buy goods. So I think the decision to focus on this trade issue is very important, because finally leaders have accepted that we are not going to prosper if we do not open up to each other's markets. I mean, across the continent, you've always heard how it is difficult to sell, let's say, from Ethiopia to just even the neighboring Eritrea in the past. It was very difficult. So I think the fact that countries are gradually opening up to begin accepting that trade is a virtue that we need to keep is very important. Look at the percentage of intra-Africa trade. It's very low. You find that only 15% of the trade in Africa is between countries on the continent. The rest is with the outside world. That's very, very shameful. And yet it could, beyond building our communities, beyond building our economies, I think trade can also enhance good relationships and maybe keep good ties that we need to integrate our continent. So I think the concept is beyond just the economic benefits. It helps countries to even remain peaceful and stable. I mean, people who are busy trading will have nothing to do with carrying guns, for example. So I think it's a very good long shot for the continent to take. And if implemented, I think it's going to help as a very great deal. Look at the European Union, for example, one of the most integrated places on earth. Because of these kinds of connections, there has been very less instances of insecurity or instability. So I think this is going to help the continent just beyond financial benefits. It's going to help achieve a greater deal of stability from companies that work across borders, for example, providing services across borders. And this has largely been between bilateral arrangements between countries where these companies operate. So having this kind of opportunities elevated in the continental free trade area, I think it will provide more job opportunities to everyone who is involved in this kind of businesses.
Evaluating the implementation of African continental free trade was the central point, the main point of the session. So how do African leaders assess the implementation of African continental free trade area? Because you were there in the session.
Yeah, I think they are raising great questions. I mean, they admit the challenges. For example, say, for the last 1 year or so, we have had a pilot phase of trading. It's called AFCTA guided trading phase, and I think those kind of in experiences will provide a good lesson for the continental leaders to choose the gaps that to choose to fill the gaps that have existed in our trade. For example, you realize that even countries that already existed in a regional bloc, for example, IGAD, you find that they had a lot of taxation on each other. They had a lot of trade barriers imposed on each other. They had a lot of sanitary conditions imposed on each other. So I think the continental trade is going to ensure that we have at least harmonized standards on products that we need to sell from each other. And I think it's a good opportunity for the leaders to look into these gaps and enhance the trade opportunities that we need to have. The good thing is that every leader, at least for now, is supporting that kind of arrangement. So we hope that there is political goodwill from the beginning, and this is going to help us implement this trading arrangement better. Obviously, countries have taken long to implement it. I mean, since 2018, at least we should have already launched a number of things. But the AFCTA itself is not a solution entirely, because there are other protocols by the African Union which have not been implemented. Look at the agreement on open skies, which is supposed to allow flights to fly a little cheaper across the continent and faster, which means that there will be fewer stopovers, or I think long layovers. This has not been agreed entirely. Some countries have not signed on it, others have signed on it but not ratified. So these kinds of delays are going to affect the FCTA in itself, because you need to move to sell your service or goods. And there's also the protocol on free movement of the people. I think it's a 2015 agreement, which many countries have not yet signed on it. So it's going to depend on the success of other protocols, because trade does not exist in a vacuum. It exists where people can move freely. It exists where people can move safely. And it also exists where it's cheaper to move. So all these things are going to combine to affect how the FCTA succeeds.
All right. I have learned that the African Continental Free Trade Area was established in 2018, but it has not been fully implemented. Two questions here. Firstly, what progress have been made so far? And secondly, what are the challenges behind fully implementing this agreement?
If you ask the experts involved in the FCTA, they will tell you that more than 70 trade barriers have been eliminated between countries that have ratified this agreement. And so far, they have tested the trading opportunities that exist between regional blocks. Let's say the East African Community, for example, trading with the ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States. In the past, that was nearly impossible. I mean, there was no trading connections between west and east of the continent. Now it's possible under the FCTA. There is also a trial period that showed that actually African continent can trade more between the regions where countries belong. The East African Community already has an existing arrangement to ensure open markets, but there was still non-tariff barriers that were being introduced. Now, those ones may not be possible under the FCTA because you'll be violating a continental arrangement. So it pushes countries to be more continental than just in a neighborhood kind of players. And the challenge has been very obvious. I mean, the original challenge that we talked about, lack of infrastructure to enable faster movement of these goods. We don't have roads linking west and east. We don't have railway lines linking north and south. We don't have airports that are active and allowing flights to fly cheaply. We don't have, we have a lot of a very restrictive taxation regime across the continent where passengers have had to pay a lot in fees. They have a lot to spend in layovers, and the connection is not as fast. So these are going to have to improve for us to implement this FCTA.
Okay. So what has to be done to fully implement the agreement? What's expected from African leaders, and what is expected from other multilateral organizations like United Nations and other organizations?
Well, first and foremost, I think we just need to keep the peace. I mean, our continent has been so pummeled with wars and conflict that we always have to look over our shoulder in most places. I think this has to stop. I'm sure that the silencing guns ambition that the African Union has had, and of course, which missed the deadline 2 years ago, I think they have to focus on that area. People should stop fighting. People should remain peaceful, because without that, the FCTA will have to take a back burner. And then, of course, we need to implement the other attendant protocols across the continent. I spoke of free movement of people. I spoke of open skies. I mean, countries need to start implementing this arrangement so that we can fly cheaply. I mean, there's no point having to pay $300 between Addis Ababa and Nairobi, for example, a distance of just 1 hour and 30 minutes. So it doesn't make sense, because it means that where we would have alternatives to travel, we only have one opportunity, one method of traveling, and this makes it very costly. So the continental trade will have to depend on those three areas if we have to make any step forward.
Let me take you to the big picture of African Union. The former Organization of African Union, or AU, and today's AU has been established with the major objective of maintaining African unity and creating more prosperous, peaceful, and democratic Africa. So in your mind, do you think African Union has achieved its very objective?
it has tried, but not entirely achieved all the objectives. I mean, Africa is more peaceful today than it was 20 years ago. But that, of course, doesn't mean there are no conflicts or there's no instability. Of course, one of the ambitions, one of the forerunners for the African Union, one of the countries that pushed for its creation, Libya, for example, now it's almost a broken country, and it's a very it's one of those things that we worry about every day. How Libya turned from one of the big economies on the continent to what it is today. So it reminds us that things can change very fast if leadership is not leading by leadership is not in the right hands. So the continent, of course, now it's easier to travel than in the past. Remember when we used to have to go to Europe to go to Morocco? I mean, it was a shameful incident where people had to connect flights from east to west via another continent. But there are challenges. Some countries have plunged back into instability, unfortunately. Look at Sudan, look at Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso. Of course, the enduring conflict in the DRC and the Central African Republic. These are countries that have had problems, and which I think the African Union has not been strong enough to just guide the leaders back to peaceful fall. Of course, Ethiopia is still a situation that is fragile and rebuilding itself from 2 years of conflict. We hope that they can maintain that momentum. And so the African Union has a lot of work to do, for example, involving people that traditionally saw the continental body as elitist. I'm sure they have now started involving youth and women, for example. I saw Mr. Faki appointing a special envoy for the youth and also a special envoy for women. This is quite encouraging because these are people who are traditionally left out of continental decisions. So we hope that in the future, the African Union will be for the people and not just a special category of leaders. How AU succeeded in pushing for decolonization of the continent. I mean, when it was formed, several other countries were still under colonial powers. And by the time it transformed to the AU, I think almost the entire continent was independent. This was a positive thing that they pushed for general self-governance of the people across the continent. And I think it is going to be the same to watch for the African Union. Like after 50 years of independence across the continent, then what should we be focusing on? Maybe it should be economic independence. And I'm sure the fact that they are pursuing things like FCTA or open skies means that they now want people to be economically independent. We don't want to depend more on donor funds, for example. We want to generate our own income. We want to live a life of dignity. We want to live, enjoy connecting with our friends across the continent. I mean, to be honest, I think in the past it was very difficult to keep friends in other parts of the continent. Even Ethiopians and Kenyans, for example, you couldn't have many friends. But now, because of this, we move according to these purposes of the African Union and related functions. I think we are gradually integrating more and more. So I think integration is one area that they have done better, encouraging connections between different regions and different peoples. This is a success story. And also the fact that they insist that there should be no unconstitutional changes in government. It's very interesting because look at how every country that has committed a coup since 2002, it has always been suspended from the African Union. So there's no favorism, there's no selective decisions. It applies to everyone, whether you are Sudan or Burkina Faso or whichever country. It applies everyone. So I think this is one of the success stories that we should celebrate at the African Union.
So what are the challenges ahead of us?
The challenges ahead of us is the same old story. I mean, we need infrastructure. We need to build roads to connect our countries, and we need to reduce those non-tariff barriers that I talked about, because as long as they are going to exist, it's going to be still difficult for countries to interact between borders and do business. So this is one area that needs to be addressed. And of course, there are countries that have plunged back into conflict. We need to help them back out of that incident, so that we can be on the same page of reconstructing the continent.
So what has to be done to further strengthen African Union? What's expected from African leaders, politicians, academics, and the mass African youth population?
We depend a lot on donor funding to run our operations. Continental bloc should not run like that. I mean, we need to be predictable. We need its programs to be a bit assured of funding to the very end. As it is, since we depend more on donors, it means we can't really be independent and make our decisions that affect the continent without first pleasing our donors. So it's a very difficult situation to be in. And so member states must raise their funds and contribute in time. I was seeing a report of contributions, and some countries haven't contributed for 2 years. I mean, we can't blame them because of probably the situation they're in, but they need to up their socks and help the continental body function predictably.
Ethiopia is going to celebrate the anniversary of Adowa Victory after a couple of weeks. So do you have a message regarding this resounding victory?
Yeah, first of all, that battle was taught to us very much in history classes in high school here. It's one of the battles that teachers used to use as an example of Africa's determination. So I think even before we knew how Ethiopia looks like, really, at school we were learning in books how it resisted the colonialists and how it fought and defeated them. So I think it's an inspiration. It should always remind the Ethiopians of their heritage and how they are pride for the African people. And so it is an inspiration that should be remembered and be used to ensure that the country prospers and never relapses in conflict again. I think this is what I can say to the Ethiopian people, that always keep the spirit of your forefathers and build the country. That victory was taught to many groups across Africa. It was always told to many groups across Africa that Ethiopians did this to defeat the enemy. Obviously, Ethiopians knew their terrain better than the foreigners, so it was an advantage to the local people. Even though they were using, you could say, rudimentary weapons, the terrain was very important. And I think all the post-independent groups across Africa knew or learned from this incident that when you know your homeland better, the foreigner cannot defeat you no matter the weapons. You just need to be committed to the cause.
Aggrey Mutambo, a journalist and editor at Nation Media Group, thank you for sharing your in-depth knowledge regarding the 36th Ordinary Session of African Union Assembly and on the general achievements, failures, and the way forward regarding African Union. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your dedication. Have a good time.
I thank you for inviting me to the show. I hope to be more available to discuss these issues that affect our continent in the future. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. And I hope I will see you in another show. And for the time being, goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Africa.